Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian for the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. Are you one of those individuals who uses baking soda to whiten your teeth, keep your refrigerator from smelling, or to clean your house? Did you realize the main ingredient, sodium bicarbonate, can be also used to help athletes enhance performance, specifically those who are training for speed and power? In this podcast, we speak with Pat Dixon, Director of Applied Sports Science for Momentous, to learn more about the research on sodium bicarbonate, also known as sodium bicarb. We specifically discuss how it acts like a buffer, the impact of lactic acid on training intensity, the research behind sodium bicarb, which athletes benefit the most, dosage guidelines, and the potential side effects if using too much. Pat began his career in exercise science at the University of Connecticut while pursuing a master's degree under William Kramer, and also working in athletics as a strength and conditioning coach. Previous publications online and in print have focused on athlete development with a focus on improving power production and performance. He spent 18 years working with college athletes at UConn, Cal Berkeley, St. John's University, and Loyola Marymount University, with a focus on improving performance and decreasing incidence of injury. While working with athletes, his efforts helped shape multiple NCAA tournament appearances and Sweet 16 finishes in women's basketball, soccer, and volleyball, as well as a national championship in softball. Pat, welcome to the All Me podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks, Tavis. Excited to be here.
So this is a topic that a lot of people I don't feel is going to really know a lot about. If they're just general lay person, as we talk about sodium bicarbonate and athletic performance, we're going to get into that in just a second. But even in the world of sports with sports dietitians, strength and conditioning professionals, this is, I think, one of those unique dietary supplements or ergogenic aids that has, a lot of different science that you're going to share with us today. But before we get into that, let's learn a little bit about your career path. I know we were chatting before we started this, and your work with the Flyers and some other things you're doing. But let's tell us about your path of getting in the field of where you are now in sports nutrition. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Momentous and your background.
Wow. So my background. So 3-sport athlete in high school, also a science nerd. So I started looking at like exercise physiology programs and ended up at the University of Connecticut and got my start there in 98, right? That was my freshman year and had a lot of fun learning from what I know now are some of the best people in exercise physiology and sports nutrition, right? So at the time, got to study under Carl Marish, Bill Kramer, Larry Armstrong on the ex-phys side of things. And then, got to study under Dr. Nancy Rodriguez on the RD side of things. And so really from early on, I've been fascinated with, how the body under the right stimulus can adapt, right? And for context, I graduated high school at like 183 pounds or so. And by the time I graduated college after, 4 years in the weight room, 2 of which were, on the track and field team, I weighed, 215-ish and, could do some really fun stuff. Right. And so have always just been fascinated by how food, how the right training, how the right supplementation, nutritional interventions can really help the body adapt. And so at UConn, I got a master's degree in exercise physiology, did some biomechanics stuff. And then my undergrad, had a minor in sports nutrition, but my path took me into strength and conditioning. I then ended up in Cal Berkeley for 3 years. I was back at St. John's University in New York City running the show for men's and women's basketball there for 7.5 years, and then stepped out to Loyola Marymount University in Southern California as an assistant AD. And while I was there, really wanted to kind of bring the business aspect of athletics along with the performance side. So I ended up getting an MBA in finance. My current role with Momentous, I'm the director of applied science. And so that role entails everything from, trying to be an advocate on education, doing some of the deep dive on PubMed, to product formulation, right? Like pressure testing. Hey, if we're going to build a pre-workout, what are the ingredients that we need to have into it? And then also working with practitioners. And so that's really where I get a ton of my joy from, is talking with people that are in the trenches saying, hey, I wish I had this tool, or I wish I had that tool, or, hey, how do I help? We were just talking about concussion protocols. And so there's all this information out there, but the real key is how do you distill it into 3 or 4 actionable bullet points? Because the practitioner in their day-to-day doesn't have 3 or 4 hours to go fishing for the information. And that, I think, is really the best part of my role. Like, I'll be at PHATs, I'll be at PFATs. I get these opportunities to just share information and just say, hey, these are things that you should probably look into in your practice, that the science says, hey, it's going to help your athlete. But more so, how do we keep the practitioner kind of up to date on the latest information? Because you and I both know from our time in athletics, like, people get administratively suppressed, right? There's too much to do. There's never enough time. And it's really about, hey, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to educate myself, but I just don't have the bandwidth. So I guess that's my world in a nutshell.
Yeah, it feels like work-life balance doesn't even exist anymore. It's just grind until you can't go anymore. And, I love the fact that you mentioned, the group at UConn. I mean, that was known as the group of, like, the longest time. That's the program you want to join. Right, especially if you go in the exercise phys with Dr. Kramer, Armstrong, you mentioned Nancy Rodriguez. I think Jeff Volek was on staff there at one point.
Yeah, Duncan French, who's out at UFC. You got Barry Spearing was doing his PhD. Dan Judelson doing his PhD. Like Tina Murray, who now is the VP of Performance for Pittsburgh Penguins. Andrea Hootie. Like, I never knew how good I had it until I'm looking back and going, like, I was just learning by osmosis the entire time.
Yeah. And for those that were listening, and, when Pat mentioned PHATs and PFATs, he'll be presenting at the Professional Football Athletic Trainer Society and Professional Hockey. I think you're going to be at PFATs this weekend, you mentioned, or you're heading out tomorrow?
Yeah, I head out tomorrow to PFATs. I won't have the opportunity to present there, but, we'll have a booth. And really the goal is just to talk about, hey, what are things that can be used to enhance cognitive performance and mitigate some of the TBI challenges that are out there? And then also actually talking about sodium bicarbonate as well.
So let's lead into that. That's today's topic, sodium bicarb athletic performance. First of all, can you give our listeners a little bit of an overview? What is sodium bicarbonate?
So you're going to find it in your kitchen. It's baking soda. Super simple, right? And for any of the RDs or anybody that's done clinical rotation, right, it's one of the major buffers in the body that's used specifically with blood buffering. And so you'd see it in the hospitals, like anybody that comes in with any type of acidosis or sepsis situation, like one of the first thing a doc is going to think about is, hey, I'm going to push a bag of bicarb in an IV. But from the really high level science, right? Like, our body has these really interesting buffering systems in it that allow it to maintain pH in the way that the body feels is best for it to work. And just like your car, when it gets overheated, doesn't operate really well, your body, when it gets outside of these pH ranges, doesn't operate as well. And so bicarbonate is one of those natural things. It's produced in the body, but it naturally allows, your system to maintain pH in the blood.
So and when you talk about buffer, and different things like that, or in acid buildup, so we're talking things like lactic acid, correct? I know we're going to get into the exercise science part or training part, but is that one of those key components that are going to be part of that discussion today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, kind of this misnomer, right, is the concept of lactic acid, right? And it's really, when you think about natural metabolism, your body is going to produce a lactate molecule, and it produces a hydrogen ion. And what happens is, because of the charges of those two separate molecules, they naturally associate in the blood, which then gives us this idea of lactic acid. But for the people that are listening to this, I'd rather like you to think about lactate as a buffering molecule. And what we've actually learned in the last, let's call it 10 to 15 years, is that lactate is like jet fuel for the body. It's a really, really great energy substrate. So anytime we can take that hydrogen ion and get a buffer in there that can associate with that hydrogen ion more quickly and more readily, it actually frees lactate up to be used as an energy substrate, which is something that should be really interesting to anybody working with, let's call it high performance athletes, that kind of like power, explosiveness. Like, when you're concerned about that, like, lactate can actually be a pretty good thing.
So when we look at certain types of exercise and how blood becomes a little bit more acidic. Does exercise intensity play a pretty big role in producing more?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like your anaerobic system is 100% going to produce more of the hydrogen ion. But I also want you to think about, hey, if anybody's done like a VO2 max or a treadmill ramp test, right? It starts out as very aerobic. And when we think about like a distance runner per se, we don't necessarily associate that with a really, really high lactate hydrogen ion producing environment. But then on the flip side of it, speed in an endurance event is based on our ability to maintain performance at a max level, right? So it's kind of porpoising in and out of that lactate threshold where our body can process that hydrogen ion effectively enough to maintain speed and maintain, an oxidative manner, an aerobic environment. But then there are portions of a running event at distance where you're going to go more anaerobic. Let's call it, you're trying to overtake somebody, you're trying to break away from the pack, that type of thing. So I think for a listener at home, there's going to be application in buffering to both, that high intensity, high work rate, but then also thinking about, hey, how might this actually support more of an aerobic effort over time?
So it kind of leads into my next question, because my first part is what does the research say when it comes to supplementing with sodium bicarb, for the athlete, right? Is it beneficial or better for maybe just a strength and power athlete? But I think you're also mentioning, hey, for that person that's doing an endurance event and they're getting to that last mile, that last minute, 2 minutes where they maybe need a sprint to win, then maybe it's beneficial for both types of athletes because they're switching energy systems.
Yeah, it gets really interesting, right? Like by and large, the research has looked at, high energy environments, so sprints. So anything, up to, let's call it 60 seconds duration, you might be able to stretch that out to 5 or 6 minutes, right? So when we think about that, like, let's talk about, a timed mile or less. If you work in the rowing community, like in erg, so a 6K is going to be in between 5.5 and 6 minutes, depending upon water conditions. But then there's also kind of this extrapolated science where we can start to think like, like if I can maintain better performance in the sprint, like how does that necessarily affect the rest of my workout and the running mechanics and the things that start to break down over time? Like that gets to be a longer 3 or 4 hour session.
So can you give an example of a few different sports where you feel like, I know we're going to get into the science of this and really talk about, what does the research say, but a few sports where you say these are sports that probably would really benefit from, I heard you mention rowing, maybe track and field, or are there any specific sports that this is where sodium bicarb really has a pretty nice benefit?
Yeah, I think anything where you're using a stopwatch to gauge success, right? So if you're in the pool, swimming, on the track, absolutely. If you're looking at repeated maximal efforts. So I think football is super interesting because you start to think about what a series looks like for an offensive line, and you're basically getting in and out of a squat position, going as hard as you can for 5 or 6 seconds. You get the remainder of that play clock to recover, and then you're asked to do it again. And so you start to look at that, and it gets really interesting. Soccer's another one because the style of play has gone from, kind of this, smaller footy, depending upon, the coach's preference, but you have this max sprint, jog, walk, recover type of setup. And so there could definitely be an impact in the soccer space. And I think last but not least, you start talking about the weight room a little bit, and you start talking about, people doing CrossFit. You've got this high intensity intermittent exercise or anything where that you're going to be going as hard as you can for reps or for time, and then trying to recover in a compressed environment. That's going to be where you're going to start to see some benefit.
Now let's talk about supplementation form. How is sodium bicarb used? Is this come in powder? Is it come in? What are the types of forms where people could use this?
Yeah, but bicarb is super fun because it's basically baking soda, right? So the cost isn't super high, but the challenge is always GI distress. And so, if you look at the body of literature, like some of the first research that was done was in the 30s at Harvard University. But then more of the recent work started in like 1977 under Jones, that looked at participants, in a 40-minute submax cycling test. And then kind of like the early 80s is where we get the typical dosing pattern, which is 0.3 grams per kilo. But basically what you're talking about is sodium bicarbonate is a basic electrolyte. And what you do is you mix it in water or a fruit juice, and then you just drink it, right? Super, super straightforward. But again, the GI distress is what can be a little bit challenging. And so more recently, they've played with a couple of different like carbohydrate loading phases. So like, you have some of the sodium bicarbonate in a drink, let's call it 90 minutes or 120 minutes before training. You might have a piece of toast with that, with some jam, and then kind of stage it. But then to be more effective at it, now we're talking about, a protocol that's 2 hours long, and to try and really kind of break it down so you're not taking in a large bolus of bicarb at the same time. But the research is unbelievably solid, right? And so whether you're, on the track, right? There's 3 different studies. They looked at 400 meter, 800 meter, and 1500 meter. And the benefit to using oral bicarb was a 1.5 second increase in the 400, 2.9 seconds faster in the 800, and then 4.5 seconds faster in the 1500. And when you start talking about margins in sport, what's so interesting is what that time actually means from a distance perspective.
4 seconds is a lot.
Right? So when you think about the 400-meter race, like NCAAs last year, the finals were between 4.4 and 4.5 or 45.8, pardon me. So 44.13 and then 45.83 seconds. So you're looking at a window of a second and a half. So right there, you're talking about the difference between finishing first and finishing dead last in the finals. And when you start to stretch that out to the 800 and the 1500, like the 1500 meter, that's the equivalent to 26.6 meters, which is like being in the finish frame and like not being in the frame at all. So it just gets super interesting. And then, if you take it to team sport, whether it's basketball, March Madness going right now, or football, right? These fractions of time, if you could help an athlete be a half a second faster to the ball on, let's call it a slant route or a flag route, you're talking about the difference between catching a ball cleanly and potentially having a defender get a hand in the way. So the change, the benefit is very much meaningful.
Yeah, I don't think people realize, what those seconds mean, especially in an Olympic sport, a track and field sport, or in many other sports as well. Like you mentioned, like in a basketball game, a couple of seconds could mean a win or a loss. That's significant. Now, you mentioned dosing. You said 0.3 grams per kg. For those that might be trying to figure out, what does that mean? So if someone's 200 pounds, they'd be about 91 kilograms. That's about 27 grams of sodium bicarb. Now, would that be taken at once, or are we going to spread this out? What's the dosing look like? Like, what's your recommendation there?
So you definitely want to spread that dosing out, right? And like I said, 90 to 120 minutes. You might break it up into like 3 separate drinks, but then you also might say, hey, for this athlete, they've got a really upset stomach. I don't want to do it. And so I think for the practitioner, what that really means is playing with it, starting at like 0.2 grams per kilo, and then kind of working your way up a little bit. But I can't stress enough, there are some athletes that have no problem with bicarb. None. There are other athletes that no matter how well you stage it and how well you dose it, they are always going to have some type of GI upset. And for example, right, GI upset, what I mean there is if you've ever done that volcano reaction with baking soda and vinegar in your kitchen, that volcano reaction, that's effectively what happens in your gut. And if your athlete is more acidic, there's going to be a faster reaction, which means more hydrogen gets released, more bubble gut. But then there are other athletes that we have that aren't super acidic, in which case that reaction can be minimized. But, it's one of those things where you'd want to talk to the athlete, you want to kind of work them through it. You'd want to run like a couple of test samples to be like, hey, how do you feel? This isn't something that you're just going to pull out on game day and be like, hey, let's rip it. I heard about this on a podcast and I think it's going to work for you. Please don't do that.
You got a few people probably sitting here going, wait a minute. It's like, what's going to happen? A volcano is going to erupt in my stomach. I'm going to pass on that, right?
Yeah,
now,
hard pass.
With certain things, creatine and other nutrients, we've been told, hey, take this with carbohydrate, maybe a sports drink or some sort of sugary beverage. It may increase the uptake. into the muscle. Is it the same with bicarb, or does it matter if you drink it with water, a carbohydrate beverage, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, the carbohydrate has a tendency to break it up a little bit. Like I said earlier, toast and jam has been something. If you wanted to have, some pretzels or something like that, you could also have an opportunity to hey, mix it in with your favorite sports drink. There are a couple of different strategies you can use there, and I'm not trying to evade the question, but this is so highly individualized that it
Right.
really is going to take a little bit of kind of practice between the practitioner and the athlete to kind of find that sweet spot. Because, just like I said earlier, some people are responders, some people aren't, right? There are some athletes that I've worked with that caffeine, 90 to 100, milligrams of caffeine, and they are wired, ready to go. Performance boost is there. I've also worked with other athletes where they take 200 milligrams of caffeine before an event and it does nothing for them.
Nothing.
Right. So having that conversation with the athlete and kind of working through it becomes really important.
So let's talk about something pretty cool and unique that Momentous has. You have a topical version that I'm sure our listeners are going to want to learn more about. Can you discuss your PR lotion product? This seems pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's really a cool project. It's what got me to step away from athletics. So I met Jeff and Erica, who are my two co-founders, and they were like, hey, we're working on this project. And basically the technology for transdermal delivery was started by a company that was looking at trying to get medications across the skin, trying to do medical interventions. And they had some really early success, still working on it. Some fun clinical trial stuff going on with them. But then they said, hey, what in the athletic space, what in the performance space might be fun to try? And that's why sodium bicarbonate came up with. And so known as PR lotion, we basically use a lipid micelle to encapsulate the sodium bicarbonate so that we can get it through the skin. And what it does then is it basically tricks the skin, the fats and the proteins connecting it, to absorb it without breaking down the integrity of the skin. And so for any of the older practitioners on this call, you've heard of things like DMSO, which breaks down the compound, the sulfates actually break down the proteins in the skin. That doesn't happen with PR lotion. And we've just gotten a paper published, shows a 28% increase in alkalinity, so less basic, becoming more basic in the muscle. That paper was published by the University of Oregon, and so we're really excited to get that one going. And then we've got another paper that we just had accepted by the Journal of International Sports Nutrition. That's going to show some on-field stuff. But the first presentations of in and around PR lotion were actually in 2018 at the American College of Sports Medicine, and that product really took off in the cycling and the running community very quickly. And slowly we've progressed into the team space to the point where, we work with, I want to say 80% or better of the NHL because it's such a high lactate sport.
So where would someone use PR lotion, and what part? What is it? The quad, a certain location where it's best utilized?
What we've said is basically any of the muscles that you think or expect to be sore or are doing the most work is where you should apply it. So, for a runner, a hockey player, football player, it should be low back, hips, glutes, quads, calves all the way down. In the triathlon space, we have athletes that love it for that upper back and those shoulders for the swim portion of things. And so we actually have a number of schools in the Division I space using PR lotion on their upper body in the swim space. So I think general rule of thumb is any muscle you expect to be sore tomorrow, that's where you're going to want to use the PR lotion.
And I would think the side effects would be significantly less than consuming it orally.
Yeah, there's no side effect, right? So using it on your skin, no GI upset whatsoever. And what we've actually found is reduced muscle soreness 48 hours after a workout. And so I think that brings us back to hey, what does pH really do in the body, right? And there's a couple of different ideas in and around that. The first one is by maintaining pH, you actually allow your muscles to sustain a higher intensity for a longer period of time. And that has to do with, local enzyme reactions, local muscle function. But then the other thing is, what does that free radical do when it sits in and around the muscle? So that hydrogen ion really, if you're not getting it out, what type of damage can that do to the local tissue from an inflammation perspective? And then does that inflammation then press on the local nerve endings, which leads to DOMS? And so that's very much one of the theories out there. And so, for anybody here that works with track athletes, more often than not, you'll see cross-country runners when they get back from a long run, they're laying in a hallway with their feet up against the wall because they think that's going to help the quote unquote lactic acid get out of their legs.
Interesting.
So lots of fun stuff there.
When y'all did this study, did you look at creatine kinase at all, or was it just reported muscle soreness by the subjects?
So that first one in 2018, it was done by Mark Kern out of San Diego State. It looked at some heart rate stuff. It looked at lactate amount. So heart rate was 3 beats per minute lower, at the same power output. We increased lactate by 11%, which makes sense because if you have a buffering agent in the body that's buffering that hydrogen ion, your body can naturally go further and work a little bit harder, which is going to create more lactate. And then that decrease in muscle soreness was something that we're still trying to chase down to kind of quantify. But, the challenge rate becomes you don't want to overcook a research proposal and you want to kind of make sure that you're staying in the middle. But it's super interesting, super interesting.
Excellent. Now, if you look at the science, and this is the question I'm curious about, but would using it topically be more effective than oral? Do we have research to compare the two?
So the International Sports Nutrition paper that's going to publish actually compares oral to PR lotion. And I can't get into the details on that one because you guys know how blackout periods are around journals. Yep. But basically the idea was looking at counter movement vertical jump, 8 times 25 meter sprints, then looking at counter movement vertical jump, and then looking at yo-yo intermittent recovery 2 test. And the goal there was to look at, does speed improve at the 25 meter sprint level? Does RPE go down? And then how does that then affect overall ability to complete the yo-yo IR2? I'm going to give you guys some cheat notes here. PR lotion was beneficial, made athletes faster, decreased rate of perceived exertion in the sprints, and then in the yo-yo test actually made athletes faster as well. But the minute that comes out, it should be open sourced. So Tavis, I'll make sure I get you a copy, and whomever wants to take a look at it, they can get to you for it.
Absolutely. Now, when you look at taking this as a supplement, from the topical side, can we do it on a daily basis? Do they have to wait a couple of days? How often can you use it?
Yeah, so it can be used, any day that you want performance, right? So beta alanine is the other buffer that's out there. But beta alanine, depending upon your loading protocol, right, it can take weeks to get to a meaningful amount in your body, right? And that's not me saying it. That's the International Olympic Committee saying, hey, could take 6 weeks, but most of the time it takes 10 to 12 weeks of 3 grams per day. That's beta alanine. Sodium bicarbonate, it works the day that you use it. And that's what's so interesting about it, because let's say you've got an athlete that sometimes compliance is a challenge. This will work race day. This will work the day that you try it. But the other interesting piece is, for any of the strength coaches or track athletes out there, it's about compounding days. It's how do you have multiple great days in a week to try and get to that benefit? Because I'm not necessarily going to make myself faster or stronger in one day. But if over 4 weeks, I can keep stacking great days together where my bounce back is faster, I can attack the weight room, I can attack, the track, the pool, the bike, whatever that is, all of a sudden those compounding days actually help me improve my performance over time. And that statement in and of itself is supported by a paper by Wang et al. It's 2019. They looked at peak power during high intensity interval training over time. And that one, they found that over 6 weeks, and again, this is oral sodium bicarbonate use, but if they used oral bicarb over 6 weeks, they found that roughly peak power was significantly higher using sodium bicarbonate by almost 21% versus the group that was using a placebo. They had improvement, but they only got up to roughly 7.5% improvement. And so I think really what it comes down to is, how do we stack those great days back to back? And then how do we give the athlete something where they potentially could feel less sore, they could feel less fatigued, they could feel less burnt out? Because we all know how stacked some of those days can be. And anytime we can do a little bit of a give back for an athlete, it becomes really important.
Yeah, and we don't think about that because those sports, the hockeys, the footballs, it's not about this. I mean, it is about the seconds and time, but it's really, there's no stopwatch. It's who scores the most points at the end of the game, and who gets through the season, in all in one piece, and they're recovering better. And if we can just do anything to get their body to feel a little bit better than what it would or could, then that could go a long way. And that's a massive improvement in outcome.
Yeah, I mean, right. You look at the NBA or the NHL, right? You got 82 games a year, right? That can be draining. And often, in that middle to last quarter of the season, it's less about who's the better team on the court or on the ice, and it's about who's less beat up, who's less sore, who's less injured. And I think about college athletes, right? Like, they're going to class. When I worked at Berkeley, I mean, the scholastic load on these athletes, as well as, hey, I also compete in the Pac-10. It was the Pac-10 at the time, but like, that level of competition, right? Like, you're pushing really hard in both areas. And so if I can help an athlete be less sore on their way to class, or feel a little bit more confident in their body, like, I'm all for it.
Well, and it seems like athletes today just seem to get injured a lot easier than they've ever gotten injured. I'm looking at the pitcher from, was it Puerto Rico, Edwin Diaz, jumping up and down after a game, and he ruptured a patella. And then basketball players are always out with a toe injury or something. That's like, I don't remember seeing so many players in the past get hurt so often. So, I mean, I know it's a different conversation, but that's where this can come in and make a big difference.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. I mean, we've got, tissue quality is a challenge, right? It's how do we make sure that we've got the right bone density, the tissue strength for, collagen, so soft tissues, tendons, ligaments, cartilage, right? But then we also have to look at how our diets have evolved, right? We don't drink a lot of milk. It's almond milk, it's oat milk, it's soy milk, right? How much cold cereal do you get in? Like, we trim our fat, off of our chicken. And so, like, as some of these changes get made in our dietary patterns, it does affect the types of nutrition and nutrients that we get in on a daily basis.
Excellent. Outside of performance, if we look at sodium bicarb, are there any potential health benefits using this that's not related to performance, or is it just really performance is where it works?
I think that's really interesting. I was on your previous webinar, and somebody asked about alkali water, and it just, please don't, I'm not supporting alkali water in any way, shape, or form. It's been debunked. Please don't, there's no benefit, right? But I think bicarb is one of those things where we're still kind of learning about it. And, because of the GI challenges previously, like, the level of research was kind of, let go, and people weren't really digging into it. And I think there's going to be a renewed interest, given PR lotion, but then also, as we go into these Olympic cycles, like, we've got Paris, and then, the US is going to be hosting in LA. And so there becomes this renewed interest about 2 years before every Olympics. And so it just becomes, hey, what are the things that are needed, and what are the ergogenic aids that we may have forgotten about because they weren't quote unquote sexy at the time, to try and find that winning advantage. But for bicarb, beyond the buffering capability it has within the body, not really sure that there are really great uses beyond that. I mean,
I just remember my parents would say, hey, if you want to get your teeth a little bit whiter, put a little baking soda on your toothbrush, or it's just hanging out in your refrigerator being a neutralizer and kind of making sure the odor of the fridge doesn't, take over. Yeah, I've seen some things on cancer. Like, I don't want to get into that discussion because that's a whole different area, but I've seen a few things, where it may be beneficial for, but again, I don't know enough about that. That's a whole different dangerous place to begin when you talk about cancer.
There are definitely some interesting inferences between pH, alkalinity, and chemotherapy treatments.
Right.
Right. So I think that's what you're getting at there. But yeah, again, that's a 2-beer conversation in another hour.
One of the last questions: is there an appropriate age where you wouldn't recommend this? Let's say a high school athlete. Are they too young, or does it really matter?
I think from an age perspective, I've never been a pill or a powder cheat person. So, like, if you have an athlete that is training their tail off, is doing the right things, getting enough sleep, eating properly, then it might be something that you want to introduce around the age of 15. But I think it's such a slippery slope, because I would never want to have, a freshman, or a middle schooler, thinking like, oh, I'm just going to do this on race day, and this is going to help me perform, or game day. So I'm always very hesitant of that. Like, you can't out train a bad diet. But if you were to say, hey, Pat, I've got a sophomore or a junior that's training their tail off, doing everything that they can, is there a potential, benefit to doing something here? Yeah, you might want to take a look at it. I think there's also going to be a group that pushes back and says, hey, your body needs to adapt to, using lactate. It needs to adapt to, feeling that stress. And if it doesn't feel, that hydrogen ion, like, you don't get the metabolic changes to your system that you're going to need. And I agree with some of that. I think that, your body does need to be challenged. There are going to be days where, like, you should be sore. But I also think that there's an opportunity to kind of achieve some balance where you're saying, like, hey, if I'm lifting 4 days a week and I'm on doing my sport 5 or 6 days a week, then, like, there might be some places where you need a little bit of give and take, because I would argue that soreness and fatigue can be just as detrimental to an athlete's performance and to, progress. Because when somebody says, hey, I'm just too beat up today to go, and then all of a sudden they just end up on a spin bike for half an hour, that's not beneficial either.
Right. Yeah. Okay. If we look at athletes, should they be training a specific amount of time per week, or, to justify using, let's say, off season versus in season, or as long as they're training intensely, this is where it's beneficial?
Right. I mean, and anytime you expect to be sore, I think that's where I would potentially use sodium bicarbonate. And so, we talked about, the track or in the pool or, on a bike, right? Those are all measurable. And so if you're telling me that, hey, today I'm training speed, like, I want max speed on the track or in the pool, then we want to feel the ability to go at max speed, where the buffering potential is going to be important. But on the flip side of it, if you were to say, hey, today's going to be long, slow distance, like, we're just trying to build up some aerobic base, then, bicarb doesn't have much of a benefit there. So, if you're going to jump in the pool and, your swim coach says, hey, like, we're going to do 3,500, at this pace, keep it nice and easy and focus on technique, like, that's not a space for PR lotion or sodium bicarbonate. But on the flip side of it, if you were to say, hey, we're going to get in the pool today, we're going to do some sprints, and we're just trying to go as fast as we can, like, that's where you're going to want to put it. On the field, if coach was to say, hey, this is going to be a tactical session today. So, for football, if we're just going to go through a couple of snaps and we're going to work on, kind of walk through, no reason to use it. But if you're heading out to the field, it's going to be a 2-session day and you might have a lift in, 100% should be using it.
Excellent. Pat, anything else you want to share with our listeners that we maybe didn't go over today?
Yeah, I think, right, like, practitioners, we're tasked with doing a little bit of research on our own, right? And anybody listening to this, like, I don't want them to have a takeaway of, like, hey, there's magic bullets or there's magic powders out there. But ergogenic aids have kind of gotten this negative undertone, since, like, the early 2000s, right? And it's not about cheating, right? It's really about, hey, what can I use out there to help my body go? And how can I help facilitate its performance? And so, as you're thinking about it, right, like, I'm always going to be a whole food first person, and you can't out train a bad diet. But on the flip side, there are some things that can be used to give yourself a little bit more of an edge on a training day, or to help potentially give yourself an opportunity to win on game day. And I think as practitioners, like, that's stuff that we need to explore so that then we can have more information to potentially apply it to our own practice.
Excellent. Pat, fantastic information. This was just such an easy conversation and great information to share. I know our listeners appreciate it, but we're not done yet. We're not going to talk about anything related to sodium bicarb or PR lotion. We're going to talk about some fun stuff. So this is our curveball round. 3 random questions. The first question is a staple. This is something I ask everyone. I love music probably more than anything else. If I can go back and do something over, I'd want to be a musician, or at least probably be a full-time musician. That's not going to happen. Anyway, you could be the lead singer of any band, whether that's previous band today. Who would that be?
Pink Floyd.
Nice. All right.
Love it. Like,
yeah, no, classic. I mean, that's one of those bands I really wish I was, at the time could have seen live.
Right.
Just they were a little bit older, so it didn't get a chance. Although I think they reunited not that long ago, maybe 5-10 years ago, to play one of those big, benefit shows. But I don't think they get along anymore.
Funny how that happens.
What would today's Pat go back and tell young Pat What's one piece of advice you would tell your young self based on what you know now?
Stay the course. It gets awesome. I think when you're younger, right? Like you kind of get wrapped up in your day to day and you think your world might be coming to an end. It doesn't. Just stay the course.
Yeah, it's like too bad we can't go into the future for like a week or something just to see what life's going to be like and get that time machine. Now, this question I've never asked anyone. I just, based on our topic today, I was like, this is going to be a little different. But if you could have invented one ingredient, whether that's on the sports supplement side, anything, what would that ingredient be and why?
Ooh.
Something that's been out, but you've been like, man, I wish I would have thought of that. Is there an ingredient that you wish you would have, or a supplement you wish you would have been the first person to study?
Yeah, I think I had a really great conversation with Dr. Kreider out of Texas A&M, and he did some of the really early research on creatine.
I knew you were going there. I don't know why.
Right, and I'm so fascinated, right? Because I wrestled in high school, and I remember all the guys were taking phosphagen, and it was like the EAS thing. You know,
Yeah.
Again, this is like 95, 96, right? And like, yeah, man, I need $60 so I can go down to, GNC to get my phosphagen. But what it does for the brain, like what we're finding out now about the benefits to TBI, the benefits to brain function, like it's just mind blowing to me. And again, as we evolve in this space, it's so important to keep doing the research and to keep supporting the researchers that are doing it and to ask questions. But yeah, but creatine, and then I think the second one, if I can follow up, would be like omega-3s. Like that's another one, just from a longevity perspective. Like there's just some awesome research out there on it. Just awesome.
No, I love those too. We were fortunate. I had Dr. Kreider on one of my first interviews. Probably was like interview 5 or 6, if I recall, and he's just done so much great work on creatine. I think there's like a new text out, a fairly new text, like 500 and something pages that really just goes into the clinical benefits and application. I think people misunderstand and don't realize creatine has so much clinical application that most of the studies don't even look at performance. They look at, as you mentioned, TBI, brain health, cardiovascular, cancer, et cetera. So great stuff, Pat. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our listeners today. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate the time, Tavis. Always. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.